My love for nature began close to home, in the woods behind my house, gardening with my mom, playing catch with my dad until sunset, making snowmen with my brother, and playing in the creek behind my neighbor's house. But to understand what I'm about to share with you today, I had to travel far from home. This started when I was 11 years old, and I went on a 3-day canoe trip in northern Wisconsin. As a child of a mother who said her idea of camping was being at a hotel with no towels, this was my first time sleeping under the stars. I remember the pine trees stretching up toward the sky. I remember the birds, the sun rises and sets. I remember cooking over a fire and laughter and singing. And soon, 3 days in Wisconsin stretched to 50 days, paddling the cold, clear waters of the Canadian Arctic. A place where I swear you can see the curvature of the earth on the horizon. It's that open. For over 2 decades, I sought and often led youth to seek nature connections in what I call big nature. For weeks or months at a time, in far-flung places from the Arctic to the Andes, my big nature time totals well over a year spent sleeping on the ground under the stars. That many days in big nature gives you a lot of perspective and space to think. Amidst mountains and canyons and waters, I discovered my sense of self. I learned that the earth and I are deeply connected, and our well-being is bound together. I developed an abiding love and care for our planet. And somewhere out there, my love for nature and my belief in the essential existential value of human-nature connections gave way to an almost unbearable question. What about the billions of kids who would never get to experience big nature like I had? How would they get to know themselves and love themselves and the earth and to know the two are inseparable? Big nature was my path, but surely it wasn't the only way. Some of you grew up with the expression, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Substitute a mango or a persimmon if you like. I'm after the concept that small, sustainable doses of something good add up. So after visiting the ends of the earth, I'm here to convince you that bite-sized apple-a-day nature connections matter. They are good for people and they are good for our planet. And we should start with kids in schools. The stakes are unbelievably high. We have a global mental health emergency among youth, widespread teacher burnout, declining academic performance in schools around the globe, unprecedented deforestation, floods, droughts, famines, wildfires, the 6th mass extinction, climate change. We are becoming less connected with nature, a trend that has massive implications for human well-being and is now accepted as the root cause of the environmental crisis. We know better. Mountains of research now bear on this question. Study after study shows that nature reduces stress and anxiety, enhances physical health, and even inspires awe. My favorite study was when there was a review of the existing literature on children and nature. Researchers found that nature connections drive better learning, support well-being, and inspire care for the planet. They concluded, it is time to bring nature into formal education, to expand existing isolated efforts into increasingly mainstream practices. So here we are, suffering a host of problems and ignoring an existing proven solution. We are failing to connect the most obvious of dots. Nowhere is the gap between what we know and what we do more offensive than in schools, where 1.5 billion kids and 81 million teachers spend their days indoors and disconnected from nature. 15 years ago, I moved to Colorado, chasing big nature, working at an elite private school where I got to teach Spanish and lead wilderness expeditions. It was a dream job. Even my commute was almost perfect. 11 minutes, almost no traffic except the occasional deer, and breathtaking views. There was just one problem. Every day, my commute took me by our local high-poverty public schools. And in those schools, I knew there were kids who had grown up in the shadows of Colorado's two highest peaks and had never even been to the base of those mountains. As I drove past, I pictured kids in stale rooms with fluorescent lights. And when I let my mind go there, I pictured this scene, or worse, repeating itself in nearly every single school on the planet. Measured in socioeconomic stratification, my commute was too far. So I switched it. I no longer drove past our local schools, I worked in them in a grant-funded job to connect underserved youth with nature. The district had recently, conveniently and coincidentally, rebranded itself with the aspirational tagline, "Learning Beyond Walls." I knew just what to do. So I took a few students to the desert on a backpacking trip in a landscape of red rocks and hidden oases. Out there, gazing across canyons cut into rock by wind and water and time, students talked about feeling more peaceful than they had ever felt before. Under a starry sky, they shared dreams with each other that they hadn't shared with each other during 17 years growing up in the same small mountain town. I remember one girl frozen in fear in a narrow canyon on day one. Her friends cheered her on and coached her on where to place each hand and foot. This is her, 2 days later, navigating that same terrain with confidence. After the trip, I asked students to share their photos with me, expecting selfie after selfie and maybe some muscle poses on top of boulders. And those were there, but probably 4 out of 5 of their pictures were of red canyon walls, a desert rose, a cactus. Big nature had worked her magic with these students, and I was glad. But what about the billions of other students who were not out there? On that topic, a sentence in my job description kept me up at night. It said I should make the programs that I designed during my grant-funded position self-sustaining beyond the grant. My big nature, way beyond walls approach was in no way self-sustaining. Big nature experiences are amazing. They're also expensive, logistically complex, infrequent, and out of reach for most schools. To reach all kids with nature's benefits and to make space for all kids to connect with and love the earth, we would need a different approach. 6 high school students actually came up with the answer. After interviewing their peers about connecting with nature, they came to me and they changed my life in one sentence. They said, "Becca, if we want every kid in our community to connect with nature, we have to do it in the schools because that's where we are." So here's the idea, which is their idea really. Build nature connections into daily school life in bite-sized, sustainable doses. I started this by training teachers in our schools to take their students outdoors next to the school building. I figured this way, students could get at least a little bit of nature, feel the sun on their faces, maybe see a bird fly by and wonder about it. Maybe it could help. It couldn't hurt, I figured. This teacher took her students outdoors for a spelling test under trees. Every single student got their best grade of the year. Coincidence? I hoped not. Another took her students outside to collect 24 nature objects to study factoring. They made 8 groups of 3 and 3 groups of 8 and 4 groups of 6 and so forth. She said they learned the lesson just as well as when she taught it indoors, but they were calmer and she felt better. Over time, we learned that these nature connections can happen indoors too, which is a good thing because we are an urbanizing, increasingly indoor species, and we built many schools in cities with barely a patch of sky, let alone safe, nature-rich outdoor spaces. This teacher got creative and glued nature scenes on the inside of testing shields. Her students didn't suddenly love taking tests, but they said they felt better. Another teacher with a rowdy class started playing nature sounds at the beginning of the day. She had a student with a hypersensitivity to noise who wore a watch tracking noise levels and stress markers like heart rate and perspiration. One day, that student came up to the teacher after class and she said, "Today you forgot to put on the nature sounds. I can see it on my watch." And sure enough, that day stood out as the loudest, and her heart rate had spiked. If you're feeling skeptical, you are not alone. A month after my first training, an old battle axe of a teacher came up to me in the high school hallway, and she said, "Becca, I took your workshop because I thought what you were doing was a bunch of crap. But now I believe there's a whole other type of intelligence that's unlocked outdoors. I have a student who's never participated indoors, and outdoors, he's a leader." Later, she wrote to me and she said, "I asked him, 'Why do you participate so much more in the outdoor classroom than indoors?' And he said, 'I don't know. My brain just seems to turn on.'" He had not gone to a mountain or some remote wilderness area. He was sitting on a tree stump next to a building. I couldn't believe it. I started to think, if birdsong from a computer can calm a classroom, and if sitting on a tree stump next to a building can turn on a brain, we should be doing this in all schools. So I co-founded Good-Natured Learning to equip educators to embed apple-a-day nature connections in the way they teach. Shortly thereafter, my family moved from Colorado to Kenya for my husband's job. And I thought Good-Natured Learning would become a side hustle. Instead, it came alive in ways I never could have imagined. A seasoned Kenyan educator listened to what we were doing in Colorado, and she said, "This is good for students and good for teachers. Let's go." Weeks later, we launched with 14 Kenyan teachers. The results? Identical. A teacher took her students outside to sequence the events of a very hungry caterpillar with cards hung on bushes. Even her most disruptive student was transfixed. Another said that teaching on this rooftop in an informal settlement was a therapy. Sophia took her special needs class out to a grove of trees next to the school, and they sat on a circle on the ground. As they sat there, a small branch fell from a tree. One boy, 9 years old, who had never spoken, suddenly pointed and said, "Tawi," branch. His first word. She couldn't believe it, but I could. I could fill this room with goosebump stories of nature experiences next to schools, in the shade of a building, on a rooftop, under a single tree, even indoors, that led to learning breakthroughs, to joy, to wonder, to calm, to awe. It doesn't matter if the school's in Nairobi or Colorado, public or private, rural or urban, affluent or under-resourced. Teachers worlds apart say the same things. So hopefully you're convinced that nature connections are good for students and good for teachers. But there's still a fundamental question I haven't addressed. Are apple-a-day nature connections enough to motivate kids to love and care for the earth and themselves, to know that they are inseparable? Research tells us there are 2 factors that predict whether or not kids grow into adults who love the earth. One is frequent experiences in nature. The second is adult role models who care about the natural world. In schools, with teachers facilitating apple-a-day nature connections, we have both. But the truth is, I think this question of kids' love for self and planet is more about adults making space for something that children already know. Children and educators are players in an education system bent on academic achievement. Can students read, write, and do math? We even have an acronym for it. FLN. Fundamental Literacy and Numeracy. In support of literacy, a teacher in Nairobi took her preschool students out on a phonics walk in search of the letter sound of the day, looking for insects, expecting to find butterflies and crickets. Instead, her students found a dying bird. Their eyes got big. They asked her why. She didn't know. Maybe it fell from its nest. Then the students quieted, and one boy turned, as if by instinct, to gather leaves. He began delicately placing them on the bird's body. Other students followed. The teacher made space for this unplanned moment of interspecies empathy because she understood that this, not phonics, was a day's lesson. That day, fundamental literacy and numeracy gave way to a more primal FLN, a fundamental love of nature. I know that these are anecdotes and not data from a randomized control trial. That will come. And without any more data, I know that students don't wonder about a bird that they can't see. To ensure a flourishing future for all of us and for our planet, we need to reconnect with our roots, with our nature, and with ourselves. This can start with an apple a day. Parents, aunties, uncles, grandparents, cousins, neighbors, everyone can build apple a day nature connections into their daily lives. Do it for yourself and for the children in your lives. Teachers can add nature connections into their classes on Monday. All of us can advocate for apple a day nature connections in school, because if we put our minds to it, we can ensure that nature connections are part of every school on the planet. So tell me, what will be your first bite? Thank you.